Thank you, Melis. First of all, I would like to mention that I'm very, very honored that I can share the stage today with great people from Sitra and Demos, because I see that you have gotten much further along in your discussions about the future of work. And so during this presentation, please keep in mind that the scenarios are just the beginning, and I think the fun part happens after that, and I'm looking forward to hearing about this experience after my presentation. I also want to start with this joke about kids, because Melis brought this up. My 5-year-old daughter also one day asked, like, "Mommy, who did you want to become when you grow up?" And I said, well, I wanted to become an opera singer, even though I have never managed to sing very, very well. And then she said, well, but you became a mom instead. So maybe she thinks it's a work, and I think, as we see also, these homeworks are becoming more marketized. But 2 remarks before I go to the content of this seminar. As Melis mentioned, you may have noticed that this event was with invitations only. So I would very much appreciate if you take this scenario still as a working document. I will give my best to present them today to you, but you still have a chance to provide your feedback, and that's why we have invited you here. And I also appreciate if these scenarios would not go outside of this room yet. Secondly, as you can see from the screen, the project has been quite big. It's not about scenarios only. A lot of people have been involved in the project. We have a steering committee of 14 people that have come together for more than a year to define the focus, what would be the aim of this kind of project, what kind of topics to cover, and also more than 30 experts have been involved in providing the research for this study, for the scenarios, and the interest from the wider public has also been quite big. And I'm very happy about this because I hope we have managed to do some explaining about this new phenomena. So the point of departure of this project was to understand what the future of work is about. What are the main challenges and trends, and not to look at only from Estonian perspective, but see which are the big uncertainties that might affect us in the future. And the destination is to make sense of it all and to see which trajectories we are undertaking and where we might be heading off. Just a very brief overview of the research that has been done in the past year and a half. So in total, 9 separate small projects are being done. Most of them are already published. We have some fact sheets in Estonian. Some of you already were looking at them, I saw. And even though scenarios might seem like a center of this presentation today, then strong experts from Praxis and Center are also finalizing what does it mean in terms of social protection. Where are we now? How can we classify Estonia as a social protection system and scheme? And what does it mean in terms of these trajectories that we are providing in the scenarios? I will not have time to bring out all the interesting results from these studies, but they do give some light on the changing concept of work. Dr. Kaira Holtz is here today. She wrote an excellent piece on virtual work and presented it in our conference this spring. We also made a very intriguing analysis of the Estonian employment rates and the future of demography. So it turned out that if we were to increase the education levels and the participation of minorities in the employment market and extend the age of retirement, all of these are ifs, but if, then we might actually compensate some of the decline in the number of people that are here in the employment market in Estonia, which is a central question for us. How do we manage if there is less of us? So feel free to go to our website, consult these studies if you haven't done so yet. There are some fact sheets, some long studies. It's all very interesting. But to make sense of it all, I would like to bring out two major trends that start playing in these scenarios. So the first of it is the structural change in employment. This is the part where Meelis mentioned that the economists always say that, oh, we've had this change, we've always managed to cope with it, it's natural. And since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we see that this kind of change towards the more services and away from the agriculture has been it has been the way forward. It has brought along economic growth and well-being, and yes, for most part, we have managed to overcome the revolution in textile industry at the beginning of 19th century. We have not started working less, as Mr. Maynard Keynes mentioned in the beginning of 30s, that it will be only 15 hours a week. So the change has not been so rapid, right? We might say that, why do the scenarios? It's probably not a big deal, we'll manage. But the question is in the pace of the technological change, and have we reached some kind of threshold where there are some people who actually don't have much chance to find a new work if their work was automized. So in all the predictions about automation, we see that it's a real issue. It does concern people on routine jobs requiring rather non-cognitive skills. And on the other hand, as the technology becomes more and more complicated, it also requires special skills. It requires people who know maybe, they know the wider picture, but they also have this very specific knowledge. And the skill gap is widening. There is a lot of talk about polarization. So oftentimes it's very difficult to understand where does it come from if the routine jobs are disappearing and then the high skilled jobs are emerging. But it needs to be understood that there are certain types of low skill requirement, with jobs with low skill requirement that we'll always need, at least in the next 20 years. And the more we have people with high incomes who are well off, who want to devote a lot of time to their work, the more they look after finding babysitters, go to massage, have their own coach, life coach, go to restaurants. So this is actually where this polarization kicks in. The second trend is the work revolution. These are just some of the names which have, yes, and the 3D printing picture, which have emerged in past 10, 15 years. We did not all have these cell phones in our pockets some 10 years ago. So this has brought along a huge change. We see that both traditional work is becoming more flexible, and the new forms of work are emerging, and they are not defined by geographical borders. We might not understand this potential at the moment yet, but the global online labor market is emerging very fast. So I'm heading towards scenarios. And the question here is, are we living in this, what we call a tuna world, which is usually a big requirement or a prerequisite of doing scenarios, because you might realize at one point that the extrapolation of the current situation might not give me much information. And I think we are. If we put all these keywords, and this is only a fraction of them on the board here, we don't really know how they are going to work out what is our own situation in this uncertain world, and what is going to be the final result. So there are many options and potential ways forward. Yeah, so we're going to now look at the scenarios. Of course, before going to scenarios, there need to be some basic assumptions done. We have much more of them, but I would just like to remind some. First of all, we did assume that the political institutional framework will not change radically. On some of the scenarios, we might see that the change is so big that you start associating it with larger societal kind of disruption. We will not dwell into these kinds of very radical changes. We also assume that work is not just for earning income, it's also associated with a person's self-appreciation and meaning of life. And if people can do so, they do prefer to work or do something similar to work. As I mentioned, home activities and these kinds of stuff might play into the picture. The trends that we are seeing now in terms of new forms of employment, we assume that they will be increasingly important in the future. The meaning of work will become even more blurry. Already now, it's very difficult to differentiate between work and entrepreneurship. And it might have huge consequences to the taxes and rights and obligations of people. And looking at the demographic trends, we see that there is an increasing number of people, for example, in Africa, which provides a lot of the population growth in the world, but also elsewhere, and taking into account that it's much easier to travel and to work in different places, the migration flows will continue to increase. But there is an exception in terms of policy requirements, which we'll come to very shortly. So when starting to make scenarios, you know, the challenge is that you have to somehow conceptualize the world in very few dimensions. So it was a long procedure or long process to come up with this framework. And the thing to keep in mind here is that it's very easy to make scenarios where you start off from the current day and think that, well, if I start doing this or that, it might get me to the right direction. Or maybe I do the other thing and then I get to the other direction. But the challenge that we wanted to undertake was that we wanted to see if there are some external influencers that might take us here or there. What would be our reaction to this, and how does it work out in these scenario worlds? So, firstly, the impact of technology became one of these big uncertainties. I have seen so many discussions where people are on totally opposing views, whether the effect of technology on employment will be mostly in destroying the jobs, or it will be outperformed by the new jobs that emerge. In both cases, the effect of automation is there. And the second issue that we have seen is that in order to be able to realize this potential of technological development, we need people. We need skills. We might need them for 2 months or a year. And we need this kind of flexibility in employing highly skilled people. That's why the other big uncertainty in our scenarios is the attitudes and policies towards migration from countries outside the EU. And this is the scenario framework. And I'm trying to explain it in a very, very simple way so that you could come along. Let's hear afterwards whether it has succeeded. And this is a basic scenario framework that we came up with. It starts off with, I'm wondering if I don't have. On the upper right side, the technology does give opportunity to automate, but also opportunity to create jobs. And at the same time, the attitudes toward migrations are rather liberal in the EU. And please take in mind the context is without the Estonian reaction to it at the moment. The second one, if we go down from there, the context of the migration is still liberal, but for some reason the technology has the automation effect overpowers other effects. Thirdly, we come to a corner where we see the automation effect dominating. For some reason, this effect is much stronger than the creation of new jobs. But at the same time, the migration is closed. We are not friendly towards migration, and the policy is also restricted. And on the upper corner, we have a potential for rapid technological development and the creation of new jobs, but the possibility to employ people for it is restricted. And then in scenarios, we look more thoroughly how does it affect the demand and supply of the employment, atypical work, migration and risks for people, but also to the social security system in different contexts. It's very thoroughly explained in our report, but I will try to give you a glimpse. So let's look at the first scenario, where the technology gives a great opportunity to create new jobs, highly skilled jobs, and at the same time, the general trends of migration have come to the point where it's more liberal than at the moment in the EU. In Estonian, we call it the talent hub, Tallinn. So it's a scenario where the fast development has resulted in a strong startup culture in Estonia, and also the companies can use the possibilities of the technology to become more innovative, to create more highly skilled jobs within the existing industries, but also a strong international community and innovation center is being born in Tallinn. And why do we call it Tallinn is that very often these kinds of talent centers are not in countries, they are in cities. They need concentrated space, they want knowledge spillovers, and they want to interact with each other. So in this scenario, we see that there is this international elite. Estonians are also part of this, but at the same time, it might bring along some problems for our regional development and discrepancies between different regions. It's a world where it's easy to employ people for shorter times. There are a lot of people who are independent employers who have started their own company. They also provide their services on a global scale. The migration levels are high, but at the same time, it's on two directions. It's also great potential for Estonian talent to go abroad. In this scenario, what then happens after we see that this kind of concentrated wealth has emerged? It means that very soon we'll be needing some other services as well. And there might be, in this kind of world, there will probably be also immigration in the categories of lower skilled people. So the differences between different regions in Estonia might be very different in terms of the characteristics of people, and Estonia would need to think through thoroughly the education policies, language policies, etc., and the polarization might be quite high. And here, most probably, it would need to be thought through what kind of social protection is being provided for people who are independent workers, and this model might be thoroughly changed. Moving on, we see a world where the external, these big uncertainties in terms of technology is that the automation is prevailing. People are starting to lose jobs very quickly in the world in general, and there are great opportunities to automate processes, but the process of innovative and highly skilled job creation does not come along. And at the same time, it's fairly easy to travel around to employ people from other countries. So putting this into Estonian context, it's, we have played it out in the scenario in a way that it encourages Estonian companies to postpone these investments needed to become more efficient and more productive. It's always very difficult to find a balance between employing people with very few skills and finding ways to become more efficient. And we cannot say for sure what's the right border. But in this scenario, we do play it out in a way that this gaining efficiency is being postponed in Estonia for such a long time that we start losing competitiveness. And at one point, when industries in other countries have become much more efficient, it does mean that you either automate or you die. And it does bring along a very sudden increase in unemployment, which will be the main problem in this scenario. At the same time, we do need highly skilled people, and it's very easy to employ them in this world, but it does not offset the shock that we'll be facing. So the what-if question in this scenario is how to encourage the needed level of automation from the very beginning. So the third scenario, and this is very different from the world we live in at the moment. It's a world where work migration is not very easy. It's being restricted, not the immigration from the third countries is not possible, but in all cases we do assume that the free movement of labor within the EU is still possible. So this is a thought exercise. What happens if the rapid change towards automation starts from the very beginning? It's actually very difficult to come up with kind of a final vision what would be the reaction of Estonian companies. Does this scenario mean that the Estonian companies themselves could undertake this need for investment and the business model change from the very beginning? And we see this increase in unemployment in certain sectors from the start, or it's more similar to the previous scenario where we postpone this as long as we can, and in the end, the competition from other countries will prevail. But we see that this scenario also gives some opportunities. I've seen some people, some very renowned economists who say that if we look at the decline in demographic, in the number of people that we have, automation might be our bliss. But we have to discuss and consider very carefully what it means in terms of skills mismatch. If some people will be losing jobs, what are they going to do? And is this the scenario where we can encourage everyone to do what their heart wants to do? Do we have money for that? It's up for discussion still. And the fourth scenario is where we combine the employment creation effect of the technology. There is a potential to be innovative, to change the business model, to use the digitization to create more highly skilled jobs. But at the same time, we cannot find people with specific skills that we want to. It is possible to find these people from within the borders of the EU. It's much more difficult to find some people from the outside of EU, but we have to take into account the wage differences, and that in this kind of world there is a very, very strong hunt for talents, which means that in the context of if the growth opportunities are limited, our own talent would most probably actually go abroad. It's a scenario with the least polarization. It's at the beginning of the scenario period, it starts off with strong labor shortage and increasing wages. People on the employment market might feel themselves quite comfortably, but in the long term, it might mean staying in a middle-income country trap or lack of opportunities and perspective. So it's a scenario where we might feel quite okay when being home, but when going abroad, we'll understand that we're poor. But it's also a scenario where we have to rely on the skills and knowledge and experience of the people in this country, the 1.3 million people. And it poses the most serious question on how to most efficiently upskill the skills of these people and use this resource to our favor. As I mentioned, there are many more dimensions that we look into in the report. There are so many issues that start playing in this, understanding this picture, and there are some dynamics that I didn't have time to bring out. But when looking at the risks, we see that the three main ones will be in this scenario: the skills mismatch. It will be much more important that people educate themselves, take courses, maybe reorientate towards during their life, also after the formal education. And when we look at the current statistics, and it will be especially important among people who are on the low skill category. So currently, this participation or this drive to become smarter and get new knowledge is quite low in Estonia. Second issue is the polarization segregation. In most scenarios, we see that it's going to be a problem. And when we look at least the segregation numbers in Estonia, the opportunities for people with different education levels, from different gender, from different nationality, and in different regions have deepened in the past 20 years. And finally, all the issues emerging from different forms of contracts, the pauses and transformations in work life. How can the government make a step forward to help people overcome these issues? We currently see that 14% of Estonians do not have health coverage, and 43% of registered unemployed people do not get benefits, as I can refer to the report provided by Praxis. But some final words. First off, please do take into account this is not a prognosis. It's a scenario. These scenarios are very extreme. Among them are none which we see entirely desirable, but we see that in all of these scenarios, there are some positive aspects, there are some negative aspects, and they are more of a thought exercise for us to understand what should we do now if we knew that this kind of scenario was to become true in the future. And the second one, as I already said, this is just the beginning. We are participating in different working groups. We'll be doing discussions in the parliament. We also are very open to remarks, suggestions, discussions in different groups. And I hope that if nothing else, then it at least gives a longer perspective to the future for us and something to discuss about. I already see that in public there is a vivid discussion going on. Thank you.